Cleveland, Ohio. If a tentative contract between the City of Cleveland and its rank-and-file police officers goes forward, the city may run afoul of certain provisions of its court-enforced settlement to reform its police department. Specifically, the proposed new contract calls for some tweaks with how and when officers face discipline and how long that discipline would stay in their personnel files, Cleveland Police Patrolmen's Association President Steve Loomis said Friday. At least one of those changes may not conform with the consent decree city reached with the Justice Department in May 2015 to address long-standing unconstitutional policing practices. Other clauses could also raise questions. While the union's negotiators are tasked with trying to get the best deal for its members, the city has a duty to enter into a contract that conforms with the consent decree. When asked whether he worries about the union contract running afoul of the consent decree, Loomis, a longtime critic of the reform effort, said it doesn't worry me in the least. What worries me is being unfair to the men and women of the police department for political purposes. Most interestingly, the tentative contract says an officer cannot be disciplined for misconduct if an investigation is not completed within 6 months of the complaint being filed, Loomis said, adding that a complaint must be filed within 6 months of the incident. The clause, as it reads, could disenfranchise people who have filed complaints against officers with the beleaguered Office of Professional Standards, which came under fire from the federal monitor overseeing the reforms because it allowed cases to languish for years. Loomis, who lost a recent election for union president to Jeff Falmer and will step down in January, pointed out that wait times for these investigators are also unfair to officers. Having to wait years to find out the results of an investigation is a huge problem, he said. The tentative contract says that any discipline imposed on an officer, whether it resulted from an ops investigation or otherwise, would only stay in an officer's personnel file for 3 years. The current contract says the discipline only remains in there for 2 years, but that is still far short of what the consent decree requires the city to work toward. Cleveland Police will work with the unions to allow for sustained disciplinary findings to stay in an officer's record for 10 years, the consent decree states. Loomis said punishment should not remain in an officer's file for a decade, Loomis said. The city tried for 10 years, but we weren't budging on that, he said. The union acquiesced and allowed blemishes to remain on an officer's record for another year because the city gave officers a pay raise, he said. As for complaints against officers, the new contract will allow for anonymous citizen complaints against officers to be investigated and, if the officer is found to be at fault, allows the officer to face discipline. Complaints, anonymous or otherwise, can be made over the phone, online or in other ways. The contract allows for this because the monitoring team flagged a provision in the current contract that says all citizen complaints must be filed in the citizen's handwriting and be signed.